The night was quiet except for the distant hum of engines and the occasional clang of metal against metal. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried along the dimly lit platform, suitcase wheels rattling against the uneven ground. She had almost missed the train, and her heart was still racing from the rush of getting there just in time. The carriage smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. Warm air greeted her as she stepped inside, brushing away a lock of damp hair that clung to her cheek. She glanced at the numbers above the seats, searching quickly until she found her row. With a sigh of relief, she slid into the window seat, setting her bag at her feet. She loved window seats, the way the world blurred by, like fragments of someone else's dream. Emily settled in, tugging her sweater's sleeve down over her hands, and pulled out a small paperback from her bag. The seat beside her remained empty, and for a moment she let herself believe she might have this quiet space all to herself for the long ride ahead. But just as the whistle blew and the train lurched forward, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone polite but firm. Emily looked up quickly, startled. Standing over her was a tall figure, his short dark hair slightly tousled from the wind, a dark jacket draped over an olive t-shirt. He held a ticket in his hand and offered her a small, uncertain smile. "I think you're in my seat." Her eyes widened. "Oh, really? I'm sorry, I must have misread." She fumbled with her own ticket, cheeks warming as she compared the numbers. To her dismay, he was right. Daniel chuckled softly, not unkindly. "Don't worry. It happens more often than you'd think." For a moment, Emily considered standing, moving to the aisle seat or finding another place. But the train was already filling up with passengers, voices rising as luggage thumped into overhead compartments. It seemed easier, and perhaps less awkward, to stay put. She gestured to the empty spot beside her. "Would you, mind sitting here instead? We can share the row." Daniel studied her for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Sure," he said, sliding into the seat next to her. The warmth of his presence spread immediately in the small space, and Emily felt a flutter in her chest she couldn't quite explain. Outside, the train picked up speed, lights of the city slipping into the dark countryside. Inside, the silence between them settled like a thin veil, awkward, fragile, yet charged with the faintest spark of possibility. The train swayed gently as it settled into its rhythm, the sound of wheels clattering against the tracks, filling the silence between them. Emily pretended to be absorbed in her book, though her eyes lingered on the same sentence, unread. She could feel Daniel's presence beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers whenever the carriage jolted, close enough that his warmth seemed to reach her through the fabric of her sweater. She dared a quick glance sideways. He sat with his ticket folded neatly in his hand, gaze directed toward the dark window. The faint reflection of his face shimmered against the glass, his features softened by the dim lights overhead. There was a quiet strength about him, but also something almost shy in the way his shoulders curved inward, as though he, too, was uncertain how to bridge the silence. Emily cleared her throat, snapping her book shut. "I really am sorry about the seat," she said, her voice low but clear. Daniel turned his head, surprise flickering in his eyes, before a smile softened his expression. "It's fine. Honestly. Besides." He gestured around the crowded carriage where passengers shuffled in, searching for spaces. This way I get a window seat without having to ask?" She laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension in her chest. "So I did you a favor, then?" "Exactly," he replied, leaning back against the headrest. "I should be thanking you." The corners of her mouth curved, and for the first time that evening, Emily let herself meet his eyes directly. They were warm, steady, and unexpectedly kind. She looked away quickly, feeling her cheeks warm again, but not before she caught the way his smile lingered. The silence that followed wasn't quite as heavy as before. It felt lighter now, stretched thin with the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted between them. A few moments later, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost tentative. "I'm Daniel, by the way." She turned to him, her lips parting as though the name itself carried weight. "Emily," she answered quietly. Their names hung in the air like a fragile promise, breaking down the last of the walls that had separated them. The train rolled on, carrying them into the night, and with every passing mile, the space between strangers began to narrow. The rhythm of the train became their background music, steady and hypnotic, as if it were breathing for them. The gentle sway rocked them closer now and then, their shoulders brushing in fleeting touches that neither pulled away from. Emily tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, staring at the blur of night beyond the glass. Streetlights and scattered towns slipped past like falling stars, but her focus wasn't on the view. It was on the reflection of the man sitting beside her. Daniel shifted slightly, resting his arm on the edge of the seat. He wasn't trying to invade her space, but the closeness was inevitable in the narrow row. He could feel her presence in the subtle perfume that clung to her, soft and barely sweet, in the quiet way she breathed. His eyes drifted to her hands folded loosely in her lap, to the delicate way her fingers traced the fabric of her book cover. The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer awkward. It was thick with something else: curiosity, awareness, anticipation. Every second that passed seemed to hum, with an invisible thread binding them closer, as though the train itself had conspired to bring them together. Emily stole a glance at him, her heart stumbling when she realized his gaze was already fixed on her. For the briefest of moments, neither of them looked away. Her breath caught, and she felt heat creep up her neck. She turned quickly back to the window, biting her lip to hide the smile that tugged at her mouth. Daniel leaned back, exhaling quietly, but the faintest curve remained on his lips. He wasn't usually the type to let his attention linger on strangers, yet something about Emily disarmed him. The silence they shared felt like a secret, something fragile and precious. Somewhere down the carriage, a child laughed, breaking the spell for an instant. Emily blinked, realizing she had been holding her breath. She opened her book again, though her eyes skimmed past the words without absorbing them. All she could think about was the warmth radiating between them, the nearness of a man she'd only just met, and the impossible sense that she'd known him much longer. The train rolled on into the night, and the silence deepened. But now, it wasn't empty at all. It was filled, with unspoken questions, with sparks unacknowledged, with the quiet pulse of something neither of them dared name yet. The train rattled steadily into the night, carrying them deeper into unknown miles. Emily stared at the same line in her book for what felt like 10 minutes, her mind far too restless to absorb the words. Finally, with a quiet sigh, she closed it and rested it in her lap. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Daniel glance at the cover. "What are you reading?" His voice was calm, curious, breaking the silence with gentle ease. Emily looked down at the book and then back at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "A novel I've been carrying around for weeks. I've only managed a few chapters." He tilted his head slightly, his smile deepening. "Too boring or too many distractions?" Her laugh was soft, genuine. "Lately?" The second one. The way she looked at him when she said it made his pulse quicken, though he hid it behind a playful smirk. I'll try not to be one of them. Too late, she teased, her voice light, though her cheeks warmed at the admission. The conversation picked up more easily than either expected. They talked about the train itself, about how travel always seemed to bring together strangers for just long enough to leave a mark. Emily told him she was visiting her sister for the weekend. Daniel admitted he was heading to a work conference, but secretly hoped for an adventure along the way. Their words flowed in starts and stops, sometimes pausing, sometimes picking up again like the rhythm of the wheels against the rails. Each new detail revealed felt like opening another door, small but meaningful. Favorite foods, little childhood stories, random confessions that would never find a place in ordinary small talk. Emily laughed again when Daniel described the time he nearly missed a flight because he was too absorbed in a book at the gate. He shook his head at himself, grinning. I've learned to set alarms now. My friends call it the Daniel rule. Her laughter filled the small space between them, brighter than the overhead lights. When it faded, the quiet that followed was different, softer, warmer, as though the train had cocooned them in their own private world. For the first time that night, Emily realized she wasn't thinking about the hours left in the journey or the destination waiting at the end. She was thinking only about the man sitting beside her and the strange, wonderful ease of being with him. The train had settled into a soothing rhythm, the dark countryside rushing past the windows like waves of shadow. Most passengers had already quieted, their voices fading into the hum of the wheels. In their row, Emily and Daniel sat with their bodies angled slightly toward one another as though the rest of the carriage had disappeared. What about you? Daniel asked, his tone softer now. What's something you've always wanted to do, but never told anyone? Emily blinked, surprised by the sudden depth of the question. She hesitated, then smiled faintly, looking down at her hands. I've always wanted to live near the ocean. Not just for a vacation, to wake up and hear it every morning. I don't even know why. It just feels like freedom to me. Daniel's expression softened, his eyes fixed on her as though memorizing the shape of her words. That doesn't sound silly at all. Actually, I think it sounds perfect. She looked back at him, catching the sincerity in his gaze, and for a moment she forgot the noise of the train altogether. The vulnerability of sharing something so simple yet so personal had opened a window between them. And you? She asked, her voice quiet but curious. Well, what about you, Daniel? What's your impossible dream? He leaned back, exhaling a slow breath, his smile turning thoughtful. I've always wanted to write. Not professionally, maybe. Just to put pieces of myself on paper. Stories, thoughts, things I can't always say out loud. Emily tilted her head, a spark of recognition in her eyes. You don't seem like the type who struggles to say things out loud. He laughed softly. I don't, most of the time. But the important stuff, the kind of things that matter, I think I'd rather write them down. The words lingered between them, wrapping around the space like a secret. Emily found herself studying him again, the way his hand rested loosely on his knee, the way his lips curved with restraint when he spoke. She wondered what kind of words he would write about this moment, about her. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with meaning, the kind that only came from sharing pieces of themselves usually hidden away. For the first time that night, Emily felt as though the train wasn't just carrying her somewhere else. It was carrying her toward someone. The night deepened, the train gliding smoothly across the darkened landscape. Overhead, the dim lights cast a golden glow, leaving everything wrapped in soft shadows. Their earlier words still lingered, but Emily sensed the heaviness giving way to something lighter, playful, alive. "So," she began, her lips curving into a mischievous smile, "if you ever write your great masterpiece, what will it be about? Travel? Adventure? Or," she leaned slightly closer, "a girl who accidentally steals your train seat?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You'd be surprised how inspiring that can be. It's a story full of suspense, tension, and unexpected twists." Emily arched an eyebrow, playing along. "Oh, really? Sounds dramatic. Will it have a happy ending?" He pretended to think it over, his lips twitching. "Depends. Does the girl eventually apologize and buy the guy coffee to make up for the stolen seat?" Her laughter bubbled out before she could stop it, bright and contagious. A couple of passengers glanced their way, but she didn't care. Daniel laughed too, the sound low and warm, carrying easily through the quiet carriage. "You're impossible," she said, between giggles, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I take that as a compliment," he replied, still smiling. Their laughter faded into a softer kind of silence, the kind that leaves traces of warmth behind. Emily leaned back in her seat, still smiling, her chest lighter than it had been all day. Daniel watched her for a moment, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just attraction. It was the rare joy of being seen, of being allowed to be himself. Emily turned toward the window again, her reflection catching Daniel's in the glass. Their eyes met briefly in the mirrored surface, and she smiled faintly, almost shyly, before looking away. For the first time that night, the space between them didn't feel like a boundary. It felt like an invitation. The train curved suddenly, wheels screeching lightly against the tracks as the carriage tilted to one side. Emily gasped softly, her body swaying with the motion. Her hand slipped from the armrest, and before she could steady herself, Daniel's hand was there, firm, steady, catching her by the elbow. "Careful," he murmured, his voice low and close. Her breath caught at the touch. His hand was warm, fingers wrapping around her lightly, not holding her down, but anchoring her just enough to remind her she wasn't alone. For a second too long, neither of them moved. The sway of the train passed, but his hand lingered, his thumb brushing the fabric of her sleeve before he slowly let go. Emily's pulse raced as she settled back into her seat. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice unsteady in a way she hoped he didn't notice. But he did. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said he felt it too. The quickening heartbeat, the sudden rush of awareness that came from something as simple as a touch. For a while, they sat in silence again, but it wasn't empty. The air between them seemed to hum. Emily tucked her hair behind her ear, avoiding his gaze, though she could feel it lingering. Daniel shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers. It was nothing, really, just the narrow space of the seats. And yet it felt like everything. Another gentle sway of the train pushed them closer, their arms pressing together this time. Neither moved away. Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the blur of lights outside. Daniel leaned back in his seat, but his arm stayed beside hers, firm and unmoving. It was a small thing, an ordinary moment in a train full of passengers. But for them, it was extraordinary. A single accidental touch had opened a door, and now the possibility of stepping through it hung thick in the night air. Outside the window, the world rushed by in fragments of shadow and fleeting sparks of light. Towns flickered past, their glow dissolving into long stretches of darkness, as though the train was moving through a dream. Emily leaned her head lightly against the glass, her breath leaving faint clouds on its cool surface. Daniel followed her gaze, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "It's strange, isn't it? How the world looks different from a train at night, like everything is more mysterious somehow." She turned her head slightly, close enough now that their shoulders pressed together. "Mysterious," she repeated softly, tasting the word. "I like that." Their reflections hovered side by side in the glass, two blurred silhouettes framed by the dim light. Emily could see the curve of his jaw in the reflection, the way his eyes softened when he wasn't trying to meet hers directly. It felt safer this way, watching him without being caught, though the flutter in her chest betrayed her. The train jolted lightly, and their arms pressed tighter against each other. Neither moved away. Emily let out a slow breath, her lips parting as she realized just how close he was. She could feel the heat of him now, the steady rhythm of his breathing mingling with her own. Daniel shifted slightly, angling toward her, his voice dropping lower. "I'm glad I sat here," he admitted. She glanced at him, startled by the honesty in his tone. His eyes caught hers, not through the glass this time, but directly. For a moment, everything around them disappeared. The carriage, the hum of wheels, the scattered voices. There was only the space between their gazes, fragile and charged. Emily's heart thudded as she whispered, "Me too." The words felt like a confession, small but powerful. She looked back out the window quickly, but her lips curved into a faint smile she couldn't hide. Daniel's hand twitched on his lap, as though fighting the urge to close the distance further. He didn't. Not yet. But the air around them was different now, thicker, warmer, filled with the quiet tension of two people who knew they were on the edge of something neither had planned, but both wanted. The train rocked gently, carrying them deeper into the night. The low hum of the engine and the rhythm of the wheels seemed to sync with the beating of Emily's heart. She shifted slightly in her seat, her shoulder pressing more firmly into Daniel's. This time, she didn't move away. Neither did he. Emily's fingers rested on her book, but her thoughts were far from its pages. She became aware of the space between their hands on the armrest, so small, so impossibly close. Each time the train swayed, their fingers brushed ever so slightly. At first, she told herself it was accidental, but when it happened again and again, with neither of them pulling back, she realized it was no accident anymore. Daniel glanced down at their hands, then up at her face. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the window, but the faint pink rising on her cheeks betrayed her awareness. He let his hand shift just enough that the back of his fingers grazed hers gently, like testing the waters. Emily's breath caught. She hesitated, then let her own fingers tilt toward his, their skin meeting in the smallest but most deliberate of touches. A shiver ran through her, subtle but undeniable. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. The air thickened between them, the muted carriage lights casting shadows across his face. His eyes held hers, steady, searching, as though asking a question without speaking it aloud. Her lips parted slightly, and though no words came, her silence was answer enough. Their shoulders pressed closer, their hands lingering now in a quiet connection. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Every inch of closeness hummed with meaning, with the unspoken acknowledgement that something was shifting, something they couldn't take back. Emily exhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of his presence envelop her. It was dizzying and grounding all at once, like standing at the edge of something vast and beautiful. She knew then that this night, this stranger beside her, was no longer just a fleeting encounter. It was becoming something more. The train slowed slightly as it curved through the countryside, the sound of metal against metal echoing like a hushed drumbeat. The carriage was quieter now. Most passengers had fallen asleep, their soft breathing blending with the hum of the wheels. In the stillness, Emily and Daniel remained wide awake, suspended in their own fragile world. Their hands still touched, fingers brushing together in quiet defiance of the distance strangers usually keep. Emily turned her face toward him, her chest rising with a shallow breath. Daniel was already watching her, his gaze steady, his lips parted as if caught between words he couldn't quite say. For a moment, neither moved. The silence was heavy, thick with expectation. The space between them was so small that she could feel the warmth of his breath mixing with hers. Her heart pounded in her chest, fast and unsteady, each beat urging her closer. Daniel leaned in first, slowly, carefully, as though giving her every chance to pull away. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingertips grazing her skin with a tenderness that sent shivers through her. Emily's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting in quiet surrender. And then, finally, their lips met. It was soft at first, tentative, the kind of kiss that asks a question rather than demands an answer. But Emily answered quickly, leaning into him, pressing her mouth to his with growing certainty. Heat surged through her chest, her hands rising instinctively to clutch at the fabric of his jacket, grounding herself in the moment. Daniel deepened the kiss just slightly, his other hand cupping her jaw. Their lips moved together with a rhythm as natural as breathing, slow but full of meaning. Every second stretched long and sweet, a promise hidden in the gentle urgency of the embrace. When they finally parted, Emily's breath came ragged, her forehead resting against his. Her lips tingled, her pulse wild, and yet she felt more alive than she had in years. Daniel whispered, his voice husky and low, "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you." Emily's soft laugh trembled against his lips. "Me too." The train rolled on, carrying them through the night. But inside their small cocoon of warmth and closeness, it felt like time itself had stopped. The train continued its steady rhythm, rocking gently as if in sync with their hearts. Around them, the carriage was quiet, most passengers lost to dreams, but for Emily and Daniel, the night had only just begun. The kiss still lingered between them, a sweet heat that refused to fade. Daniel's hand slid from her jaw down to her neck, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. Emily leaned closer, her body instinctively seeking his warmth. She felt his heartbeat beneath her palm as she pressed her hand against his chest, steady and strong, yet quickened, just like hers. Their lips found each other again, this time with more certainty. The kiss deepened, unhurried, but undeniably passionate. Emily let out a soft sigh as his arm wrapped around her, pulling her closer until there was barely any space left between them. She could feel the strength of him, the safety in his embrace, and it only drew her further in. Her fingers slid up to his collar, curling into the fabric, holding him there as though afraid he might disappear if she let go. Daniel responded with a tender urgency, his lips tracing hers, then brushing along her cheek, down toward the line of her jaw. Each touch sent a shiver racing through her, her breath hitching with every gentle press. Emily closed her eyes, surrendering to the closeness, the way his presence seemed to drown out everything else. the rocking of the train, the dim hum of voices, even the world outside rushing past unseen. All that mattered was here, the warmth of his mouth, the steadiness of his arms, the undeniable truth that this was more than chance. When their lips parted again, she rested her forehead against his, her breath uneven. "I don't even know where this is going," she whispered, her voice trembling with honesty. Daniel smiled softly, brushing his nose against hers. "Neither do I," he murmured, "but I don't want it to stop." And in that hushed promise, as the train carried them through the night, Emily felt herself fall, not into fear or doubt, but into the undeniable gravity of him. The world outside blurred into endless darkness, but inside the carriage, time seemed suspended. Emily nestled against Daniel's shoulder, her fingers still resting lightly on his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. The warmth of his arm around her held her close, shielding her from the cool drafts of the train. They sat like that for several minutes, neither speaking, letting the silence cradle them. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful, intimate, the kind of quiet that belongs only to two people who have just shared something they can't take back. Emily tilted her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the fabric of his jacket. "This feels strange," she murmured. Daniel lowered his gaze to her, his lips curving into a small, reassuring smile. "Strange good or strange bad?" She let out a soft laugh, one that trembled with nerves. "Strange good. Like, I wasn't expecting any of this. I thought it would just be a train ride." He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing absent circles against her arm. "I wasn't expecting it either. But I don't think I've ever been so glad to be surprised." Her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She turned her face toward Badiou Mehordim, their eyes meeting once more. In his gaze, she saw no hesitation, no doubt, only warmth, and something deeper that she didn't dare name yet, but felt all the same. Daniel reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch lingering. "I don't want to overthink it," he said softly. "I just want to be here. With you." Right now, Emily swallowed, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Me too." They stayed like that, watching the night roll by, occasionally trading soft words, sometimes just sharing the silence. The intimacy was no longer just in the kisses or the touches. It was in the comfort of leaning into one another, of knowing they didn't have to fill every space with conversation. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt entirely present. The train was carrying her somewhere new, but Daniel's presence made her feel like she had already arrived. The first hints of dawn crept through the edges of the carriage curtains, turning the black outside into deep shades of blue and gray. The train began to slow, its rhythm less steady now, as though even the steel beast was growing tired after the long night. Emily stirred, lifting her head from Daniel's shoulder. Her eyes were heavy, but the sight of the soft morning light spilling across his face made her breath catch. He was half asleep, his jaw relaxed, his lashes casting faint shadows on his cheeks. She smiled faintly, touched by how different he looked without the weight of alertness. As the train shuddered around a curve, his eyes opened slowly. He caught her watching him and let out a quiet laugh, his voice husky from sleep. "How long have you been staring at me?" Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Just a minute," she whispered. "Maybe 2. He stretched his arm slightly, then let it fall back around her. "You could have kept going." "I wouldn't have minded." She laughed softly, the sound mingling with the growing chatter of passengers beginning to stir. Some were pulling down luggage, others checking their phones as the signs of arrival became clearer. But, for Emily, the world shrank back to the warmth of the man beside her. The quiet comfort of knowing the night they shared wasn't just a dream. The train slowed further, brakes screeching gently as light poured brighter through the windows. Towns and fields gave way to the outskirts of the city, its buildings outlined in the glow of early morning. Emily sighed, reality beginning to press in. "It's almost over," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Daniel heard anyway. His hand squeezed hers, firm and reassuring. "Not if we don't want it to be." She turned her head, searching his eyes for doubt, but found none. The sincerity there was almost overwhelming, and for a moment she had to look away just to catch her breath. The train gave a final lurch, the conductor's voice echoing through the carriage, announcing their stop. The night had ended, but something between them was just beginning, and the golden light of dawn seemed to promise exactly that. The platform buzzed with movement as the train finally came to a halt. Passengers hurriedly pulled bags from overhead racks, the clatter of wheels against tile blending with the murmur of voices. Emily and Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, reluctant to break the fragile bubble. The night had wrapped them in. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, glancing at the door where people were already stepping out into the morning chill. "I guess this is it," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Daniel turned toward her, his eyes steady, searching her face. "It doesn't have to be." She blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as the crowd pressed around them. "Emily, last night, it wasn't just a coincidence." "Not for me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught. Instead, she let her fingers slip into his, holding his hand tightly for just a few seconds more. The simple contact spoke louder than anything she could have managed. They stood together, finally stepping off the train. The crisp air hit her cheeks, and she felt the world rush back in. Cars honking in the distance, announcements echoing across the station. People streamed past, each consumed by their own destinations, but Emily and Daniel lingered in the middle of it all, their connection refusing to dissolve with the crowd. "I don't want this to be goodbye," Daniel said, his voice rougher now as though the thought itself hurt. Emily managed a faint smile, her eyes glistening. "Neither do I." The moment stretched, fragile and aching. And then Daniel leaned down, pressing one last kiss to her lips, not hurried, not desperate, but lingering, full of the promise that the night they shared was only the beginning. When he pulled away, she felt the warmth of it long after. Passengers jostled past them, forcing them to step aside, but the spell wasn't broken. Emily knew it wasn't goodbye. It was a pause, one that left her heart racing with the certainty of something unfinished. The station was alive with noise and motion, yet for Emily and Daniel, the world felt narrowed to a single thread between them. They stood just beyond the flow of passengers, their bodies angled toward one another as if refusing to let the night dissolve completely. Daniel shifted, pulling his phone from his pocket. His usual composure was softened by something almost boyish in his smile. "I don't want this to end with just a memory," he said, his voice quiet, but strong enough to carry over the din around them. Emily's lips curved, though her heart was still thudding from the goodbye kiss. "What are you suggesting?" she teased, though the glimmer in her eyes gave away her hope. He held up his phone, the screen lighting between them. "Let me have your number." That way, I'll know this wasn't just a train ride. Her breath caught at the simplicity of it, at the sincerity in his tone. She reached for his phone, their fingers brushing once more as she typed in her name, Emily, followed by the digits that tied her world to his. She handed it back, her cheeks warming as she added, "Now, you're officially stuck with me." Daniel's grin widened, and in one swift motion he entered his number into her phone as well. Good. I was hoping for that. For a moment they both laughed, soft, nervous, and full of relief. The tension of parting was replaced by a new excitement, the knowledge that this story wasn't closing, but opening. Emily slipped her phone back into her bag, her fingers lingering against its edge as if it were suddenly the most precious thing she owned. She glanced at him once more, her voice softer now. "Call me?" Daniel met her gaze with quiet certainty. "Count on it." Another announcement boomed overhead, pulling them back to reality. They exchanged one last, lingering look before turning toward their separate paths. But this time, neither step felt final. The thread between them was stronger than distance, stitched into the promise of what was yet to come. The train was gone, swallowed into the distance, yet Emily still felt its rhythm in her chest. She stood outside the station for a moment, the morning air crisp against her cheeks, her heart refusing to settle. Her suitcase weighed lightly in her hand, but her thoughts carried something far heavier. Daniel's smile, his touch, the warmth of his lips still lingering on hers. She walked slowly down the crowded street, replaying every detail of the night. The way he had looked at her through the window's reflection, the nervous laughter that had turned into ease, the kiss, soft and inevitable, and finally, the weight of his hand as he placed his phone in hers, like an unspoken vow. Each memory was etched in her mind, vivid and impossible to shake. Emily slipped her phone from her bag, her eyes catching on the new contact glowing on the screen. Daniel. Her thumb hovered for a moment, the temptation to call him immediate, but she smiled instead, tucking it away. Not yet. She wanted to savor the anticipation, the sweet ache of waiting for his voice to reach her again. Across the city, Daniel sat in the back of a cab, his gaze fixed on the blur of passing buildings. He had traveled countless times before, but never like this. His chest felt lighter, yet fuller, as if Emily's presence had unlocked a space inside him he hadn't known was empty. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to her name. Just seeing Emily there made him smile. He typed out a message. Made it home yet? Then hesitated. Instead, he deleted it, choosing to wait, to let the promise of their next meeting bloom naturally. As the cab turned toward the hotel, Daniel leaned his head back, closing his eyes. He could still feel her leaning against him, still hear the softness of her laugh echoing in his ears. The night was over, but something had begun, undeniable and unshakable. Emily, in her own quiet reflection, felt it too. They had boarded the train as strangers, but by the time it reached its stop, they had become something more, a beginning neither of them had expected, but both knew they wanted. And in that certainty, carried separately through the morning, their hearts beat with the same rhythm. Not an ending, but the first chapter of something beautiful.